Did you ever have a difficult baking recipe and wonder, if it's this hard now, how in the world did they do this hundreds of years ago? Well, it's pie season, which was a thing, by the way. So today I'm making some Thanksgiving pies from the 17th century as my first historic baking misadventure.
I meant to say 18th century here.
While I don't have an 18th century kitchen or cooking effects, I am going to do my darndest to replicate the recipes, techniques, technology, and material used at the time. The late 18th century was a groundbreaking time in American history, especially once America won the War of Independence in 1783. In its young countryhood, America was looking to establish its own identity, and what better way to declare independence than to contribute to the culinary record of the world. Amelia Simmons was an orphan from Hartford, Connecticut, and published the first cookbook by an American, appropriately named American Cookery, in 1796. Prior to this, cookbooks published in the New World were American printings of English editions, some with American sections and some with recipes removed if the ingredients were not available in the colonies. Two popular examples of such cookbooks include the first cookbook published in America, E. Smith's The Complete Housewife in 1742, and the very, very popular The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glass in 1747. However, despite the edits to these editions, they failed to consider the techniques and ingredients of the New World, and as the centuries passed by, became less useful to the early Americans. It took 200 years for an American like Amelia Simmons to step up and publish a cookbook by an American for Americans. Recipes she grew up eating could now have a codified place in culinary history. She not only included Native American recipes featuring cornmeal, but also traditional English recipes. Her cookbook was plain and simply bound, resulting in a low price that made the cookbook affordable. Plus, she wrote in the vernacular, which not only widened its access, but acts as a record of how speech evolved in early America. We will be making two pies for American Cookery: apple pie and the first recipe for a custard-style pumpkin pie that we all know and love today. Apple seeds were brought to the Americas in the 17th century and were planted throughout the colonies. Apples are a great crop because they could be dried for the winter and rehydrated for different recipes, or just eaten dried. Pumpkins are indigenous to the Americas and were imported to England. The first pumpkin pie recipes were made mostly like apple pie recipes are, by layering slices of pumpkin with apple slices and currants. The climate was different in England than in America, as is the case today, and this resulted in less sweet pumpkins, which may be why the custard version of the pie ended up originating in America and not in England. As with all things historic, though, there is an element of interpretation. The recipes in this book are more of a shorthand for how to make dishes than more precise instructions with exact measurements and techniques. The units of measurement were slightly different at the time and also less precise, so this should definitely be a challenge. And then there's the actual baking. At the end of this 18th century, iron stoves were just coming on the scene, and only the wealthy could afford them. Many were still using an open hearth, even though some did have brick ovens, but usually they were well off. So in short, hearth cooking was the thing. So we're talking about cooking these in a pot with ashes and all that fun stuff that we're going to cover in a little bit. I am going to be using my gas range here to mimic cooking in a brick oven because that's the best that I can do with what I have. I have all of my supplies here for the two pies, and dear artisans, let's get our aprons on and let's transport to 1796. I'm gonna start with the pumpkin pie recipe because it's the most complicated and has the most quirks that could present some problems, so I figured might as well just dive in. Pumpkin pie, we're gonna do recipe number 1. It's 1 quart stewed and strained, 3 pints of cream, 9 eggs beaten, sugar, mace, nutmeg, and ginger laid into paste number 7 or 3, with a dough spur, cross and checker it, bake in dish 3/4 of an hour. Now, looking at the units of measurement, at the time, America hadn't established any kind of standard, so we were still going by the British units. In 1824, they became the imperial units, where they were more codified. But quarts and pints, they were a little bit more than they are today. So I've kind of done behind the scenes. I did a little bit of research of how to convert this recipe.
This consisted of looking at a history of weights and measures for the British Isles and using an online calculator. It took some back and forth and some frustration, but I think I got it.
I'm cutting this in half because this would make a much bigger pie than would fit into a standard pie plate. So 1 quart stewed and strained. It is way more flavorful to roast it, but in the spirit of trying something new, I've never stewed vegetables before, so let's give it a whirl. 1/2 of 1 quart is about 3 pints. A pint's about a pound. So let's cut the pumpkins up, and then I will weigh them once the seeds are removed and the rind is removed. And once I get to about 3 pounds, we'll stew them. Careful, but I got it started. It's getting it started. That's the worst. It smells good. It smells very squashy. Now you could probably make this recipe with any type of squash. You know, my grandfather was a huge fan of squash pies. It's very stringy in the middle. That's why I always kind of use a knife. And I'm only going to be using my knives and my wooden utensils. I don't have anything made of iron, so that means no silicone, none of these modern conveniences that have made cooking so much better for us. This is what makes it so much fun though. So, see, the only reason why I'm weighing it, really, they had scales, you know, they had the balance scales. And I don't know how many cooks would have actually done that. And they had measuring cups, pewter, wood. But keep in mind, this was before machine manufacturing, so they weren't as precise. And I don't think it was America's test kitchen back then. In a traditional pumpkin pie, most recipes only call for 1 container of puree. It seems like there's more pumpkin. If it's too much, I'll just freeze the pumpkin and use it for a recipe.
I got way better at peeling the rind off by the time I got to the last pumpkin.
While that's doing, let's just do a little bit of the spice prep. It calls for mace, nutmeg, and ginger. Most spices were imported and they were usually in the dried form, so I am going to use ground ginger for that reason. Now, mace, I could not find this at my local grocery store. I didn't even know what the heck it was. What it actually is, it's the pod that goes around the outside of the nutmeg nut. Is it a nut? I don't know. It goes on the side of the nutmeg. It goes around the nutmeg. Nutmegs are not indigenous to the United States, and even though Connecticut is called the nutmeg state, my understanding is that a lot of unscrupulous peddlers were using wood instead of nutmeg and selling it, especially when it was uber expensive. Hence, that's how the state got its name, because I guess they were notorious for that.
I found confirmation of this possible origin tale of the Connecticut state nickname from the Connecticut Historical Society's own monthly magazine. However, there were many legitimate peddlers of the spice from Connecticut who traveled throughout the colonies, so this could be the origin of the nickname as well.
By the late 1700s into the 1800s, spices were a lot more affordable because the Dutch had lost their monopoly over all the islands. The Brits had taken control of some of their islands. And also once we were independent, we started our own trade out of Salem, Massachusetts, particularly pepper. So this is my first time seeing what mace, oh, look at that. It smells like nutmeg, which makes sense, but it's like, I don't know, it smells a little smokier, honestly. Mortar and pestles were a necessity in any household, not only for culinary purposes, but for medicinal purposes as well. They were made out of stone, they were made out of metal, they were made out of wood. This one is granite. And as far as the nutmeg grinder, the basic design has not changed much at all, honestly. I will be using only materials that would have existed at the time as much as I can. Obviously, I'm using a stainless steel pan. I don't have copper pans, and I don't even have a Dutch oven, you know, a modern day Dutch oven that's enameled cast iron. But I will be making the pies in materials that would have only been around at the time. We just need to add eggs, cream, the spices. Sugar at this time came in sugar loaves. Could have purchased one, but they're super expensive, and since I had a bunch of sugar here that I haven't used, I didn't want to be wasteful.
I knew the pumpkin was done when it was tender when I put a fork through it and it easily fell off. After straining the stewed pumpkin, I mashed it several rounds with a wooden masher. I was astounded by the amount of water I was able to mash out of the pumpkin, and as I was mashing, I took out any rinds I may have missed when I was peeling it.
I just mashed the pumpkin. It is cooling now here. I'm going to mix everything into the pot, but I want it to be room temperature because I don't want to curdle the cream. Next is to start making the crust. We're going to need 2 crusts, one for the bottom and one for the cross and checkered top. Number 3 says, to any quantity of flour, rub in 3/4 its weight of butter, 12 eggs to a peck, rub in 1/3 or half, and roll in the rest. So this drove me crazy. It wasn't until later that I found out there was an errata section in the back, and it kind of clarified things for me. So first of all, it's only for egg whites. They used to call them puff pastes, and egg whites was the gold standard to use, not the whole egg. And it's saying that you only use 6 eggs for tarts. I don't know if they just want a different texture to it or not. So I have no clue how many egg whites to put in here. I'm going to just see how the consistency. This is 00 tipo pastry flour from Italy. So it is much finer than all-purpose flour. I'm gonna actually weigh it because of that reason. I'm going to do a pound of this, which should be about 3 cups. I am using Kerrygold unsalted butter. The reason why I'm using unsalted butter is because at the time, your butter would be made in the spring, maybe the summer, but the spring season was butter season. They would preserve it by encasing it in salt, but then when they would use it, they would rinse it off. So how much of that salt really got incorporated into the butter? Probably not that much. So for that reason, I am using unsalted butter. Fall is pie season. We're getting back to that from the introduction. I'm making 2 pies, and the reason why these recipes are so big that I have to cut them in half, at least, there's probably extra, even then, that I'm gonna have to freeze and then reuse later. It's because they would make like 50, 60 pies and store them in their ice sheds that they built underground, and they would get ice from the lakes and make a little kind of an ice house underground, or in larders underground and cold cellars underground in other parts of the country. Double crust pie recipes that I was researching call for about 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I think I'm on the right track here. I am using a cast iron pie pan. Whether or not they had cast iron pie pans specifically for pies, I didn't find any evidence of that. However, it is very possible that a pie pan would have been used, or some kind of pan made of cast iron could have been used to make a pie. Now, as I said, most people at this time were cooking on hearths, so they would have been doing it in a Dutch oven, which had 3 legs underneath. They would put it into the embers of the fire. They would then put a pie plate with the pie in there, which was usually earthenware, and then later on in this period, tin was a little bit more common. And then they would put the lid on, and the lid was deep. It kind of had like a little shelf, so then you would put coals on top of it, and that's how it would bake. I read some accounts of them actually just completely wiping the fireplace clean of the coals, and the stone underneath would be heated. Then they would put the plate there and then cover it. So there were a few different ways that they could make it. Cast iron was certainly the most durable of the materials at the time, especially if one was traveling. I am not going to blind bake this pie, and the reason why I'm not doing that is because I'm putting it pretty much at the bottom of the oven. All right, I know these are kind of heaping, but I think this is gonna do it. I'm gonna make this one a little bit less because there we go. This is a lot. Oh my God. I let this sit at room temperature. So this is 8 ounces. So I'm just going to cutting this up into smaller pieces, and I'm just gonna do little by little.
I started rubbing the butter in with the wooden spatula, but I got nowhere fast. It was super clumpy, and then I had to just face the inevitable that I was gonna have to do this completely with my hands.
So much easier just to rub it in with your hands. Yeah, no, that's dough.
So here's the last 4 ounces of the butter. There was 12 ounces in total, 3/4 of a pound. I don't think I've ever made a dough with this much butter, and it should be absolutely delicious.
It's pretty wet.
Given how moist the dough already was, I was really nervous just to jump on in and put 12 egg whites in it. So I started with 4.
Okay, so look at my hands. I don't even know how you could roll more into this. And the question is, like, these are just mediums. I think these are large eggs. Like, how big were the eggs back then? That's a spurtle. So, see, I can like nicely scrape the edges with that. I mean, it's certainly a dough, but it's just really wet. So I'm just gonna sprinkle a little bit in here. Not too much, just a little bit. Just so I can mix it a little bit more. Now it's a little bit more. Yes, here we go. All right, you can see how coarse this is, right? It's super coarse. It's not like you get it. It's not machine pureed. Now this calls for cream. Yes, I can get raw cream here from a local dairy, but they're out in the Netherfields outside of New York City, and you'd have to arrange like a complicated pickup or a delivery. I ended up just getting organic half and half. I did not get the cream because they put selling gum in it, which I'm assuming is so there's no separation. I'm going to add it in a cup at a time.
In the end, I actually ended up adding a little over 3 cups, so it was probably comparable to the measurements that would have existed at the time.
All right, let's do some ginger. I'm only gonna do this using measurements just so I'm aware of how much I'm putting in. Let's do a half a teaspoon of ginger. Let's do a half teaspoon of the mace.
I also put a half a teaspoon of nutmeg to start.
Oh, I forgot the eggs. 9 eggs beaten. It's really 4 eggs. Okay.
Since I really hate overly sweet desserts, I only put a half a cup of sugar. Most recipes, I believe, call for 3/4 of a cup or a cup.
More spices.
I added in an extra half a teaspoon of each spice, and it was perfect. To mimic baking in a brick oven, I followed the instructions of Karen Hess, who wrote the introduction to Martha Washington's book of Cookery, and she suggested cooking it on a piece of stone at the bottom of your oven and starting off at 450 degrees, and then once you put the item in, to lower it to 350 and cook it for the duration prescribed. After cutting the dough in half, I rolled out the bottom pie crust first. It was surprisingly easy to roll. I mean, it was just a dream. It is a bit on the fragile side, so when moving it, you have to have plenty of flour and move it very carefully. I buttered the pan with my fingers because that was the easiest, and I used a rolling pin to roll the dough onto it and unroll it over the pan. This minimized breakage. It took a little bit of finessing, but it worked perfectly. I didn't have a traditional dough spur to cross and checker the upper pie crust, so I used my ravioli wheel. Even though it does look like ravioli, I still think it adds some whimsy to it. I was happy with the outcome. This was so nerve-wracking. It was very delicate, but because I had cut them wider and used less of them, there was more support and they seemed to be stronger. It was pretty easy putting them on. I was really surprised by this. I trimmed all the overhanging edges and built up the pie crust around, and then with the yolks I had left over from the pie crust, I put a nice coating on it so it would brown up real nice. I lowered the oven temperature from 450 to 350 and baked it for a little over an hour.
One pie is down, 1 to go. As you can see, since I was already messy and making the dough for the other pie, I made the dough for this pie. It's already in the pie plate. I have an assortment of different apples. I have Cortland, Granny Smith, and some I do not know because they're from when I went apple picking and I don't know exactly the kind they are. The recipe reads as stew and strain the apples every 3 pints, grate the peel of a fresh lemon, add cinnamon, mace, rose water, and sugar to your taste. Bake in paste. No clue how long. I will go by a comparable recipe. A word on cinnamon. The cinnamon that we use in America is fugazi cinnamon. It's actually cassia. This came from Costco. This is Saigon cinnamon. This is not true cinnamon. True cinnamon only comes from the Ceylon plant, which is indigenous to Sri Lanka. The interesting thing about cinnamon in American history is that if you look at ads from the time in newspapers for peddlers selling their wares, they do list them separately. They list cinnamon and they list cassia. Now, true cinnamon, the Ceylon cinnamon, the bark is much finer in that it's softer and the flavor is different and it's not as dark, while cassia is darker. And according to what I've read about it, that this withstands heat better than true cinnamon. I'm going to use the true cinnamon because I've never baked with it, and so I'm curious how much it will impact the flavor. It also calls for mace, so I'll have to grind some more. And rose water. Fortunately, I have a Lebanese grocery store near me, so I have this handy. Of course, sugar and the peel of a lemon.
The recipe called for 3 pints of apples, and since a pint was more back then, it wasn't exactly 3 pounds. I ended up doing 4. I think it's interesting that I didn't have to cut this recipe in half like I did with the pumpkin pie. And even with the pumpkin pie recipe, as you saw, it yielded 2 pies instead of 1. So interesting on the quantities in these recipes. I had to reference a lot of modern day apple pie recipes to understand how best to stew these. I went by the general advice to do it until some of them were just starting to fall apart.
Okay, we got our stewed apples. Now we have to add the spices. 1 lemon. I'm using a different grater so I don't contaminate my nutmeg grater. I have no clue how wet this is supposed to be. There's already some liquid in there.
As with the pumpkin pie, I did half a cup of sugar. As I said, I don't like my desserts too sweet.
Ooh, that smells so good, the rose water. You know what? There's no way for me to test this, so I'm just gonna put the whole, it's about a teaspoon. Let's see. Kind of syrupy. As you can see, it's not as brown, right?
I know it's hard to see on camera, but trust me, it was much tanner than the cassia. I added 2 heaping teaspoons of cinnamon in total.
Oof, that smells so good.
While the filling was cooling, I rolled the top layer of the crust.
Okay. Beautiful. All right.
With the leftover dough, I cut out some biscuits to put on the top. As with the pumpkin pie, I did an egg yolk wash to brown the top, and I also, in this case, sprinkled some sugar to make it a little sweet and crispy and sparkly. For the baking time and temperature, I referred to modern day recipes. I did about 30 minutes at about 450, but then the top started to burn, so I had to take it off the oven floor and put it on a lower rack. Of course, I put the rack in backwards, so that was a bit of a struggle. It took about an hour or so to cook. I did lower the temperature to about 360 once I put it on the shelf.
Okay, so it is 10:21. I started doing this around 2:30, so it's been 8 hours. And I have to say, I am super happy with how these turned out. I was expecting at least one disaster, and I didn't have that disaster. It does look a bit crumbly, so perhaps I really needed to put 12 egg whites in them, but I felt like that would have been overkill for the amount of flour and butter that was in there. Yeah, I mean, this is still really warm, so I might have to wait till tomorrow morning to do the taste test, but I'm definitely going to taste test this one. And besides, I can't store it in the cast iron. I have to take it out before the night's over. Ooh. Oh. Oh my God, look at this. Look at that. It almost looks like cheesecake. Wow, and look how brown this is at the bottom. My instinct was correct to not blind bake it. Look at that crisp. That's all the cast iron. All right, now let me try this. The crust is really good. It tastes just like a biscuit. Oh, let's see here. I'm glad I was really conservative on the sugar because it's not, I don't like things too sweet, especially because I don't eat sweets that often. So I'm glad that I used probably half of what most people use. It has, the nutmeg is very subtle, and I don't know if that's from the mace that it's really like that. Oh my God, it's so good. It's a really good consistency. This is really good. I mean, just look at that. That's like perfect. I mean, they were onto something. I mean, there's pretty much almost a pound of butter in this crust. Because the pumpkin was not, put through a Vitamix, the consistency is very different. I don't know. I don't want to say it's like tapioca, but it's like the difference between tapioca pudding and regular just like chocolate pudding in terms of texture.
My instinct not to blind bake it, I think, was correct because it would have just ended up burning if I did both. And then secondly, look how clean these cuts were. That pan is absolutely amazing. I'm sure the tons of butter helped.
Here we go. Let's cut this puppy. Oof. It's thick. There's a lot going on in there. But I am getting to the bottom, so at least it didn't congeal or burn. I can feel it cutting the bottom. Smells really delicious as I'm opening this up. The first piece is always a disaster though. Ugh. Ah! I'm just trying the filling first, and then I'll try it with the pieces of the crust. I'm glad I was conservative on the sugar because the sweetness from the apples is more than enough. You can really taste the rose water. Wow, I've never tasted an apple pie like this before. And the apples are perfect. Some of them are kind of like mushy puree, and then there are some that kind of have some tooth to them, which is what you want. This crust is very good with the apple. The flavors complement each other very well. The cinnamon flavor is very subtle, so that pointer about true cinnamon not surviving well in heat is accurate. So if you want your pie to be have a super cinnamony, wants to be really cinnamony, that's really hard to say, then use the cassia, use the fugazi cinnamon because it will taste more cinnamony, but it's a very hint flavor. And it works though, especially mixed with the rose water. The sugar on top of the crust really adds an extra dimension. Oh, it's delicious. I can see why the Lebanese love their rose water. I'm certainly going to be experimenting with it in recipes, but it is very strong. So final thoughts. I'm pretty certain that pumpkin pie recipe is my favorite. Actually, that's my favorite pumpkin pie recipe that I've ever had. That's the best pumpkin pie I've ever made and I've ever eaten. I'm very happy with how it turned out, and I look forward to sharing these recipes with my family. I hope you can try these out yourself and be brave. Thank you so much for joining me on another crafting misadventure here in the 18th century. I look forward to more misadventures, and the next episode will be another baking misadventure from the same cookbook, so stay tuned for that. And please subscribe, it really helps the channel, and I really appreciate you watching. Take care.